Hi there, and welcome to part 3. Hi, Louis. So Louis XIV's portrait hung in the Palace of Versailles, and it was hung over his throne during his absences. Versailles is an exercise in architecture as control and intimidation. This talk is actually taken from a much longer lecture I do on the relationship between art and propaganda throughout history. And it really is amazing how much the way streets are laid out and buildings themselves control our behavior. You can't leap tall buildings in a single bound like Superman, and you can't walk through a building if it doesn't let you. So Versailles was located about 15 miles outside of Paris, which in those days would have been a mighty long journey, probably would have taken you an entire day just to get there. And it was like a miniature city. On any given day, there could be anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 people in the palace complex. It was constantly under construction, and it was filthy. There were never enough sanitary facilities for everyone, and everybody always talked about how the palace reeked. There was always building going on. It was kind of a gilded cage. I mean, there was a lot of aspirations going on at the court, and people were constantly trying to one-up each other and get themselves a leg up. But it was really very stifling kind of atmosphere where your every movement was judged and you were constantly on display. Where you got to live in Versailles was a sign of favor. The closer you were to the king and the bigger your room, the more status you had. If you were kind of a nobody, you might be shoved off in a linen closet somewhere. The worst thing that Louis could ever say about you was that he never saw you. And I have a feeling that it was the kind of thing where Louis could be looking directly at you and still not see you somehow. But that was a sign of being out of his favor if he happened to tell people, "Where is so-and-so?" Another sign of your status at court was the kind of chair you got to sit in. If you're of a high rank, you got an armchair, then came an armless chair, then a sofa, after that a high stool, then a low stool, and finally, if you were at the really bottom of the ladder, you stood. It didn't matter if you were 112 years old and if you had one leg, if you were not of the proper rank, you were going to stand. We have here Madame de Montespan, who, despite being Louis's favorite mistress, was denied having a seat because her husband, whom we see on the right, was jealous of the affair and would not accept the king's offer of a seat for his wife. Madame de Montespan had 7 children with Louis. She only had 2 with her husband. Her husband did take to riding around in a carriage that had antlers attached to the front, horns being a symbol of being cheated on, being a cuckold. So he was eventually imprisoned for his insult to the king, who was having an affair with his wife, but he was the king. And eventually the husband was exiled to the south of France. In the late 1670s, the Marquise de Montespan was implicated in l'affaire des poisons, the affair of the poisons. There were a couple of sensational and very high-profile poisonings in France around this time, and it led to a general paranoia throughout the country about black masses and infant sacrifices, and a lot of offings with arsenic, which was known as inheritance powder. Among the people arrested was Catherine Monvoisin, who was known as La Voisin, and she was a well-known fortune teller and sorceress, midwife, abortionist, and purveyor of aphrodisiacs, love potions, and poisons. Anyway, she was arrested, and they had permission to torture her if necessary, but knowing that she was kind of an old alkie, they just plied her with alcohol, and she wound up spilling. She implicated Madame de Montespan in the affair of the poisons, claiming that she had attended black masses, that she had tried to put love potions into Louis's food when his attention strayed to another woman known as Madame de Fontanges. Eventually, Madame de Fontanges died at the age of 20, and it was Madame de Montespan was accused of having poisoned her and trying to poison the king as well for abandoning her. In any case, none of this was ever proved. La Voisin was eventually burned at the stake in 1680, but it did wind up kind of soiling Madame de Montespan's reputation, and she did leave the court in 1691 when her husband died and was replaced by another mistress named Madame de Maintenon, who we're going to talk about very shortly. In any case, after she left the court, she did wind up going to a convent and spent her last years in severe penance, working her way up to the position of Mother Superior of the convent. And this here is Madame de Maintenon, Montespan's replacement, in a painting probably by a student of Hyacinthe Rigaud. Both women were extremely influential at court. Louis relied on both of them a great deal for his decision-making. Madame de Maintenon was especially known as his de facto prime minister. If the armchair that she got to sit in was any indication, she was also secretly married to Louis after his wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, died at the age of 44. Although she was very devoted to him, Louis was not very devoted to his wife. She was actually part of a treaty to end the Franco-Spanish War. And the kindest thing that Louis could say about her when she died was that that was the only time she had ever troubled him. Of course, it shouldn't surprise you that etiquette at Versailles even applied to doors. When you had a set of double doors like this, they were only both open for the king, the queen, and the king and queen's family. Everybody else had to enter through one single door, and it was absolutely forbidden to knock on any doors. You had to scratch on it with your fingernail. This is undoubtedly the most impressive room at the Palace of Versailles and one of the most famous rooms in the entire world, the Hall of Mirrors. It was located just outside of Louis's bedchamber. Imagine waking up to this every morning. And it was where he would take his audiences with his courtiers or whomever when he was on his way to chapel. Mirrors were very expensive in those days, and this is quite obviously a very opulent room, but there are expenses involved here that you can't even imagine. I'm going to read you a quote from a book called The Mirror, A History by Sabina Melchior Bonnet. Venetian mirror framed in a rich border of silver was worth more than a painting by Raphael. The mirror cost £8,000, the painting only £3,000. Louis, in building this room, actually destroyed the Venetian monopoly on glass. In the early 1660s, his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, lured a couple of Venetian glazers into France, and two of them died under very mysterious circumstances. So it was thought that maybe they were poisoned by Venetian spies. The intrigue, spying, and luring and purloining of workers back and forth between Venice and France and all the murders continued until the French figured out a way to make glass on their own in 1670, and thereby crushing the Italian monopoly on glass. It is also the most intimidating room in the palace. Mirrors generally, though, in those days were very small because they were so expensive, and very few people had ever seen their entire body in a mirror, which sounds very strange to us now, but back then, the expense just excluded even nobles from having full-length body mirrors. And so everybody is in this hall having an audience with the king or trying to attract his attention, because as I said before, Versailles was always mobbed and there were throngs of people trying to get the king's attention. And so occasionally the room was used for ceremonies, but it was also, in this case, used in the ceremonies for a way to intimidating those who were presenting themselves to the king. It was a very long walk, and the entire hallway was lined with judgmental courtiers who were watching your every move. So when Louis really wanted to put on the dog, he broke out the silver furnishings to offset all that gold in the Hall of Mirrors. There were benches, there were statues, there were candelabras and tables, and it's estimated that the amount of silver it took to make all these furnishings amounted to about 20 tons of silver, because they weren't hollow, they were all solid silver, and they must have weighed an awful lot. They no longer exist. This is a computer-generated artist rendering of what they probably sort of look like. We're going to get to why they no longer exist in the next part of the talk. This lady's looking at me in a much nicer way than that Roman actor statue guy in the last part. Anyway, you really have to think about the entire ritual of a ceremony at Versailles. You were dressed in your best clothing. And this clothing was extremely cumbersome. Some of these outfits could weigh upwards of 60 pounds because they were made out of very heavy material. There were all kinds of undergarments involved. They were also very often sewn with gold and silver thread that must have cost a fortune and weighed a ton as well. You had this huge wig on your head that was hot and itchy, plus a hat. Very often, if you're a woman, you had these very extravagant hats. And when you approached the king, of course, you could walk toward him. Oh, and you were wearing heels. But when you exited from the king, of course, you had to walk backwards because it was impossible to turn your back on the king. So at the same time, you're walking down a hallway that's very long, and you're being watched by courtiers who are very judgmental, looking for you to trip up or make a mistake, watching your every single move. And then on the other side of the wall is all these mirrors showing you your entire body, and you are aware of your body being reflected in these mirrors as well, being watched by the courtiers. So it really was a very intimidating exercise to be in a ceremony at Versailles. And on the next part, we're going to start, we're talking about how Louis used that intimidation factor to the maximum. And once, oh, I keep forgetting to move myself. I'm going to sit here with these guys again. There. Okay, so once again, this is my book, and look for it all over the internet, Your Basic Guide to Understanding Art. And here's my contact information if you want to email me. GeneVishnevsky.com is my website, and this is where you can find my classes. Thanks for watching part 3. Maybe see it part 4. Bye.